Usually when I ask students what does species mean, they tell me that it's a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And that's mostly true. But that's only one definition of what a species can be. Although the basic idea of species as distinct life forms seems kind of intuitive, defining a formal definition is actually pretty difficult. And there are four major ways that we can try and define a species. And I'm going to talk about why they're useful and where they fall apart. Those four ways are the biological species model, the morphological species model, the ecological species model, and the phylogenetic species model. The biological species concept, or biological species model, is the one that you're familiar with. This is the idea that a species is a group of populations whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring with each other, but not with members of other species. This concept emphasizes something called reproductive isolation. The classic example of this is the mule. For example, horses and donkeys are able to mate, but they have different chromosome numbers. This means that when they mate, they produce an organism, a mule, that has an odd number of chromosomes. These chromosomes cannot pair properly during meiosis, so the mule is sterile. This is used to emphasize the fact that horses and donkeys are different species. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes hybrids are not sterile. One example of that is thinking about wolves. The three canids that you can see in this picture are C. lupus, the gray wolf, C. rufus, the red wolf, and C. latrans, the coyote. These organisms have long been thought to be separate species. Recent genetic research has shown that C. rufus appears to be genetically a hybrid between the gray wolf and the coyote. If it is a hybrid, it's a fertile hybrid, suggesting that gray wolf and the coyote are not distinct species. Anyone who's observed a gray wolf or a coyote is pretty sure that they're not the same thing. They don't look similar, they don't behave similar, and they don't usually live in the same places. C. rufus is similar. The red wolf lives in different places than the gray wolf most of the time. It has a little bit of overlap in where it lives. So, which one is correct? Is the red wolf a species? Is it a recent hybrid? Is it an ancient hybrid that somehow is now a species? Do different species of wolf that recently hybridized with coyotes count? Are they true breeding? Well, yes, but then what are they? The answer to this question is we really don't know. According to the biological species model, they're not a species, but according to what we might think intuitively, they seem like they are. There are other places where the biological species concept falls apart, and that includes anything that reproduces asexually. The biological species model requires something to only be able to breed with other members of its population. But if you don't breed with anyone, how would you know whether or not you could make a hybrid? This means that it breaks down for plants which can hybridize easily and are usually viable, for most bacteria, for some parthenogenic organisms where the female doesn't need a male, like fish, insects, and reptiles, and of course things that are fossils, because who knew who they could mate with? So even though the biological species model is the one that we're most familiar with, it doesn't really work for everything, and there are some serious problems with it. The morphological species model, or morphological species concept, is based on observable physical traits, and is usually applied to asexual organisms and fossils. This is helpful because we can't really see those specific organisms mate with each other. An example would be how we looked at whales before. We can use things like the structure of their ankle to determine whether or not they're related. But the morphological species concept also has problems. For example, sometimes species look so similar to one another that by morphology we would probably not be able to tell them apart. In this example, you can see both an eastern and western meadowlark. The morphological species concept would consider them a single species, but they actually cannot produce viable offspring with each other, so the biological species concept would say that they are distinct species. So when things look too similar, sometimes the morphological species concept breaks down. The ecological species concept, or species model, defines species by where they live and the ecological niche that they occupy. This is helpful for separating species that might live close to each other but don't actually have overlapping territories. For example, in the image here, we're looking at a lot of different salamanders that are somewhat similar to each other. However, they live in different locations, their territory does not overlap, and the things that they eat is also very dissimilar, so they're actually different species. The phylogenetic species concept, or species model, defines species as the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor. It usually uses genetics or sequencing to try and relate species. So things that are extremely similar to each other are more closely related to things that are particularly different. Normally, these organisms will then be organized into phylogenetic trees, which are based off of how closely related they are. So for example, in this tree that you're looking at here, Canis latrans and Canis lupus are considered separate species based on their genetics, but are closer related than, say, Canis lupus and Lutra lutra, the otter. So now that we have all these species concepts, how do we actually define a species? Well, generally, we just try to apply species consistently, but it's really, really hard to do. It's pretty controversial sometimes, if something is a species or not. And then there's the idea of subspecies, and that's controversial too. So, in general, we just try to use as many of the concepts at once as we can. The more that fit, the more confident we can be that two things are different species. Alright, so with all that said, most of the time we'll still be relying on the biological species concept, because it's the most common one that we like to use. I mentioned that it relies on an idea of reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is set up by what we call reproductive barriers. These are things that keep species separate. They serve to isolate the gene pool of species and prevent interbreeding. Most reproductive barriers can be divided into one of two things. Either they're prezygotic, which means they happen before the zygote forms, or they're postzygotic, which means that they happen after. So let's go through some examples of each. Perhaps the most obvious example of prezygotic separation is just being in different places. Habitat isolation means that these organisms never encounter each other, so they don't have the opportunity to interbreed. An example of this is the garter snakes that are pictured here. Thamnomorphus atratus lives mainly in the water, whereas Thamnomorphus sertalis lives on land. Because they live in completely different locations, they don't have to worry about having to interbreed or not. Another example is temporal isolation. This happens when two organisms are not ready to breed at the same time. For example, these two skunk species have overlapping territory, but one of the skunks goes into estrus in late winter, and the other one is ready to breed in the fall. If a male from one species encounters a female from the other, they won't be interested in each other at the same time. This is a classic example of just not being in the mood. Another example is behavioral isolation. This happens when different organisms have different courtship rituals. Examples are things like blue-footed boobies and masked boobies. The blue-footed booby does a dance involving its feet, and the masked booby does a dance involving its bill. If the male does the wrong dance for the wrong female, she won't be interested in him at all. This is very similar to human courtship when we think about it. Everybody likes what they like, and you have to know the right dance if you want to catch the girl or boy. Another form of separation is mechanical isolation. This happens when, well, things just don't really fit. And let's say we get all the way down to the end. We live in the same place, we're ready at the same time, we like the same things, and everything fits fine. But things just don't work out. That can be gametic isolation. This is when there's an incompatibility between eggs and sperm. And this is something that's very common for things like broadcast spawners, like these sea urchins here. Sea urchins really spawn just by kind of throwing it all out there. They hurl all their eggs and all their sperm into the ocean, and then they hope for the best. Since there are multiple types of sea urchins using the same strategy, they need to make sure that their eggs and sperm are only compatible with the eggs and sperm from their own species. And that's gametic isolation. These are all of the major ways that prezygotic barriers can work. You can either not live in the same place, in habitat isolation. You cannot be ready at the same time, that's temporal isolation. You could have different courtship rituals, behavioral isolation. Things could just not mechanically work, mechanical isolation. Or your eggs and sperm may be unable to fuse with those of another species, and that's gametic isolation. So what if all of these things fail, and you actually produce a zygote? Well, then you move to postzygotic barriers. The most common and perhaps most obvious postzygotic barrier is that, well, maybe the hybrids that you produce are just really crappy. Either they die very early or they don't really get born at all. That's reduced hybrid vitality. You could have a situation where your hybrid is infertile. That's like the mule example we talked about before. This produces sterile hybrids, which prevents the species from really interacting for long term. The other option is that you could have hybrid breakdown. This happens when fertile offspring are created, but those fertile offspring are unable to have fertile offspring of their own. And this is pretty common for plants. Now we've talked about what a species is, or rather how difficult it is for species to be defined, and some of the things that keep species separate. So now we're going to spend some time talking about the evolution of populations.